Everybody, good day. My name is Tudor Fabian. I am a coordinator of the working group on trade here at SM Europe. Together with the executive director, Dr. Horst Heitz, we are very happy to have you at another one of the SM Europe webinars. Today we are discussing trade and COVID. We are going indeed through incredible times without a clear rule book of what can be done, and there's no precedent to this big crisis. So if maybe we could find a silver lining here is that this crisis can really reveal the structural problems that we face, can enable us to go back to the roots and go back to the basics of tackling policy to some extent, and it highlights what is really important. So this is why I'm very curious to what the panelists have to say about this today. We have an all-star cast. I will introduce them one by one before they take the floor. Generally speaking, as a framework for today, I was thinking maybe we could have an introduction of around 4 to 5 minutes from all speakers. And then at the end of the first round, which will be made up of the political discussion, we will have a first round of questions, and then the second round will follow up with a reaction from the business community. So very happy to have you here, and without further ado, we will start with Mr. Milosevic, who is a former Deputy Prime Minister of Croatia. He is currently a member of the Croatian Parliament, Chairman of the European Affairs Committee, and also Vice President here at SM Europe. So please, sir, thank you very much for joining. You have the floor.
Here we are. So thanks again, Tudor, and thanks everybody for joining. It's a pleasure to make this introduction today. I'll start actually from your question, from the program that we've been given, sent via email, and the question was: is coronavirus going to be the nail in the coffin of the global trade and the global economy as we know it? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, it's going to be a nail, but I don't think that the coffin itself is not robust enough and not important enough. So there are many nails, but we can expect a lot of changes. Yes, we already see and feel some of these changes. I'm also very concerned of what actually the not only the economic crisis concerning the coronavirus is bringing in, coming in so fast, but it's also the things that somehow we all expected in next couple of years due to the last recession, a lot of bad loans in the banking sectors. So coronavirus as it remains as today will have to embrace the Swedish model very soon. So I think if everybody's talking about repeating it in the autumn, I'm pretty sure that after this first couple of months, hopefully during the summer, things get out and we see the things improving, but without the vaccine or the real medication, proper and confirmed medication, I'm pretty sure in the autumn we'll have to go direction Swedish model. But coming back to the global trade, which is today the topic, the international supply chains are already disrupted. So we are seeing and we are going to see further changes. I do hope, as you, Tudor, mentioned, that we can actually learn or use this crisis for some changes. I hope that actually one of the changes that is going to be seen in following months is that some of the most important global trade partners are going direction to make things right. So starting from China, IP, international property rights, massive subsidies which are not transparent and out of the control, that don't really make the global trade competitive, or at least doesn't really make the global playground very fair to most of the players, particularly Europe and particularly SMEs. Second point is that I hope that we are going to see more focus on our European production and our own R&D and know-how. I would also love to see our focus on the competitiveness, European competitiveness, one hand, and second, maybe trying to find also new partners. I can hardly think of why all the focus in last decades was going direction China, not India. I was taught since I started my businesses before politics, never have all the eggs in the same basket. So I think that we could also start changing that. And I also, as we talk about this European production and support, I hope that we shall see that the European taxpayers' money is not going to be subsidizing the companies or the projects that are not really European, which we have some examples. And last but not least for this introduction, just to open the many issues, is the digital side of this whole thing and the future. Everybody keeps talking about the crisis, economic, health, medical crisis, but there is also obviously an issue of, again, fake news. And as on one hand, we see the social media helping people, supporting each other, etc., but at the same time, really creating a total mess of the news, which makes from the national government's point of view to really govern or to stay on the top of the crisis not really easy. So I hope that we can use the following weeks and months to discuss that. It's inevitable that this crisis is going to bring even more investments and faster developments in the new technologies, artificial intelligence, robotics. I hope European Union can actually somehow on that edge also revive our efforts, our investments, our R&D, because it's for sure that the years in front of us, we are going to see those who are going to be highly technologically developed are going to be wealthier, having GDP faster recovering, and definitely bringing in some new jobs, even actually probably tackling some of the migration issues and labor force and labor markets. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to the discussion. Hello, everybody, again, and hope to have a meaningful 90 minutes, I'm sure, discussions for everybody.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Milosevic, for that very comprehensive opening. You've touched upon old challenges and upcoming challenges. So this is great for the panelists to get it going. If I may add just one quick point, we did have initially the European Commissioner for Trade, Mr. Phil Hogan, planned for today's event. Unfortunately, due to an overloaded agenda, the commissioner could not make it. Some of us could check his input for the International Trade Committee, which just finished its sitting at 4 o'clock. This was recorded, so everybody can follow this later on online. We've had the numbers from the IMF. We've had the numbers from DG Trade as well. The situation is not looking very promising for obvious reasons. But I would like to pass it on now, as it is somehow pass on the torch from one presidency to an upcoming presidency. The German member of the Bundestag from the CDU, Mr. Ronhoff, Stefan Ronhoff, who is sitting on the Committee of Economy and Energy and also on EU Affairs. So, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Hello to everybody. So, to connect what the colleague has just said, so my interpretation is to have the overall picture is that we now see a lot of urgency measures which actually lead to a more protectionist approach. And we do see that also when it comes to trade barriers. We have seen that at the WTO, there were registered about 80 new trade barriers, and including the informal ones, we are about 150. So we see that all over the world, the countries are trying to protect their citizens, try to protect the health of their people, especially, of course, in the sector, in the health sector and the health equipment sector. And in the short term, we actually do now see quite a lot of protectionism, which is actually to some extent also justified with regards to the question of securing and safeguarding the people in their countries. What do I see in the medium and long-term run is that we will have actually two pathways, I think. One pathway is very much focusing on critical infrastructures, on critical products, which actually have been identified already with the European, with the EU screening regulation, investment screening regulation. And actually what I think is that we will have a two pathways. One is that we are more, that we are actually have more regional value chains on the question of critical products, and the other pathway will be, from my point of view, a situation where we actually do not see too much differences. And when I look at the economic recovery, which is actually necessary in the next month and years, we actually need to broaden our trade agreements and our trade agenda. I think that is quite important, even if it's difficult. So to make it clear, I think it's a question of political leadership, which direction we go. And what I see with regard to the US is that, and to the US and China, is that the actual crisis, the COVID crisis, covers actually the conflict which we have seen over the last month. But I think if I look at the US approach, which was actually directing in a relocation of production, that this in some other countries in the world and in important countries like the US will actually lead to a situation where we might see a fostered trend into relocation, into regional or even more national value chains. So with regards to the economic situation in Germany, of course, we see, as least in Europe, a sharp decline. We'll see a sharp decline in export imports and growth. And now it's a question how we can actually overcome this crisis in Europe. And I think the most important point, and that is what Mr. Milosevic just said, is to have a more integrated European internal market. That's one of the most important issues, and we really have to fight hard for that in the German presidency as well. And the starting point, from my point of view, is now already the European Council on Thursday, where we need to see some signals from the German side that we are actually want a European way and that we have solidarity within the European Union. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Ronghoff. Up next is Mr. Julian Winkler, who is former Minister of Trade of Romania, currently Vice Chair of the International Trade Committee in the European Parliament, and also First Vice President here at SM Europe. So thank you, Mr. Winkler, for tuning in. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope I succeeded in unmuting myself and you can hear me. Okay, thank you very much. I say hello to all the participants, my colleagues, panelists, and also the other participants. And I hope that we will be able to learn something together from this discussion today. I think there are many issues that we have to bring up. First of all, I would just make a brief reflection on what stage we are now exactly. What is the problem? How big is the problem? Because I think that we are at the very beginning of the happenings. And a few days ago, we received the paper from the chief economist from DG Trade of the European Commission. And this paper, they announce us that they have made a simulation, they have made, of course, a model, and based on a model, DigiTrade is telling us that they foresee a situation in which we will have around 10% of decrease in global trade, 9.7% decrease. They say also that 9.2 decrease will be the exports of goods and services of the European Union, EU 27 of course, and the imports will decrease a little bit less, 8.8%. This is the paper, but in the same paper, the chief economist tells us that based on a different model, we also have a sort of forecast of the WTO. And WTO tells us that something much worse will happen. In terms of trading goods, the fall could be anything between 13 and 32%. For the European Union, the WTO projections show us exports falling between 12 and 33% and imports between 20 and 25%. So what I was just trying to suggest to you is that I think we are in a very early stage, and it is absolutely difficult, if not impossible, now to make exact projections. We can understand the nature of problems that we will be facing. We see our industries, and we talk, of course, with industries, with SMEs, with various sectors, and they are telling us the hugeness of their problems. There are entire sectors which have closed down, not to speak about tourism, about restaurants, about hotels, and so on, and other sectors which are the automotive sector, apropos the German economy, of course, which is heavily relying. But if German economy is relying on automotive sector, then also my economy in Romania, which has as the most important partner the German economy and the German automotive industry, is also facing heavy problems. So we have difficulties in understanding exactly the stage in which we are. We know that the problems will be huge. We just cannot, it's difficult to predict how huge they will be in numbers. And then just to try to answer in a few points, in 5 points, I prepared 5 points of answering the question of this discussion. What would fight the great recession, the great problems in world trade? I would mention 5 things. Of course, there are several others. First of all, free and fair and open trade. I mean, we have to make all the efforts to stick to the idea of free trade, to not let the temptations of protectionist unilateral measures to define our actions. And when I say we, I mean also the European Union, but also the member states of the European Union. We are the champions of free trade, and we have to remain the champions of global free trade, and we have to find our allies in order to do this. My second point, a very strong support and continued support for the international rule-based trading system. And everybody knows that the WTO has huge problems. The WTO has had some problems even 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. Even before President Trump, the WTO had some problems, and the restructuring of the WTO was on the table, but without result. Now we have some positive results. For example, the litigation system, which is the new litigation system, which is initiated by the European Union, but we have to fight as a European Union as a whole, but also as influential member states, to maintain and restructure and reorganize the WTO. My third point, and of course we are the SME Europe of the European People's Party, so my third point would be strong support for SMEs. Support meaning finance, support meaning barriers to trade, support meaning an internal, better functioning internal market and access to e-commerce and many other things. I will not enter into details at this stage. Then my fourth point will be, and Tudor just mentioned, that we have had a meeting. We had at least 2 members of the European Parliament in this panel, Sean Kelly and myself. We had a meeting today with Commissioner Hogan. Of course, it was a virtual meeting, but we discussed with him the issues of the EU trade agenda. And of course, when the points on the trade agenda have been set 2 months or 3 months ago for 2020, we did not have the COVID crisis. Now we have it, and the agenda will have, of course, new priorities. But still, some points have to be maintained. For example, the negotiations agenda of the European Union. I mean, we have to have something for Brexit. We have to have something in the following months for the new trade relation between EU27 and the UK. Hopefully the closest possible, but closest possible not according to the thinking maybe of our UK partners, but according to the interest and regulations of the EU, which is today an EU27. Then China, and I will not enter because China is a topic by itself. It would be the topic for a seminar only to discuss about China. Then our ongoing negotiations with Australia and New Zealand, which are also, of course, very important in the sense of diversification of our of the EU free trade agreements network. And my fifth and last point would be a strong defense of the strategic sectors of the European Union. And here I have to make two points. First, what do I understand under strong defense? Of course, a strong but always WTO compatible defense. I mean, we can have new tools in our trade toolbox. In trade defense instruments, we have the FDI screening, as colleagues have mentioned already, but all our tools have to be WTO compatible. But then the second question under this headline, what does it mean strategic sectors? And I believe that the crisis has shown us that some sectors which maybe 2 or 3 months ago were not so very important, not so very high on the agenda, are indeed strategic sectors. So let's have a discussion. Of course, it's not only a trade agenda issue, it's also something about for the internal market, for the new industrial plan of the European Commission, which was presented and so on. But we have to define after crisis, bearing in mind the lessons that the crisis taught us and will teach us in the following weeks, which are the really strategic sectors of the European Union. If it's necessary, let's redefine this list, and then let's protect in a WTO compatible way, let's protect our strategic interests. That would be the first intervention. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Winkler, for that very sober analysis. In the beginning, highlighting 2 very important points. First of all, that we are very early on in this crisis. And secondly, that there is a very big lack of predictability. So this is a main issue for the business community. Thank you also for your 5-point scenario solution. I will come back with a follow-up question, but for now, I have the pleasure of passing on the floor to Mr. Sean Kelly, who is a fellow MEP from the European Parliament, also in the Trade Committee, as well as on the Committee of Industry, Research and Energy. You have the floor, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, great to be with you, and thank you for organising this very important discussion. We're getting used to remote working now, so part of it. And of course, sympathy to all those who were affected so much by coronavirus. It has meant a huge loss of life across the globe, and particularly in my own area. I know a number of people who died. And of course, it is now going to have a huge economic disruption, which we have seen already and will continue for some time. But we have to prepare for it and to try and come up with some solutions. The IMF has estimated that global contraction will be of 3%. And when you consider that countries like my own, we're talking about a growth of 4 or 5% of GDP, and the same last year and the year before, things never looked better. Now things looking very bleak. And The only difference between this probably and the last recession is the last recession was caused by what you might call irrational exuberance, property bubbles, reckless borrowing, etc. And when measures needed to be taken to deal with that, there wasn't a whole pile of sympathy by those who didn't engage, who were expected in some ways to bail people out. Now, the atmosphere, at least, is different this time because people know that nobody was to blame as such. More people have been affected. All businesses, more or less, have been affected negatively. And there is greater appetite and certainly greater support for bringing in measures that will get us back to normal as quickly as possible. And in that respect, that's the big difference between this time and the recession 10 years ago. Many of the companies who are now in big trouble weren't in big trouble. It was like if they'd fallen off a cliff, and now if they can get back up on the cliff, they'll be away again. And the European Union itself was somewhat slow to react. But I think Commissioner Hogan made an important point today, which is true. He said this was a health issue primarily, and health is not a competence of the European Union. It's a competence of the member states. So they were limited in initially reacting while they were slow. At the same time, they did get their act together, especially in relation to helping green lanes to move products across borders and also stopping member states from not sharing devices, PPE, etc. That all has been dealt with, and thankfully member states have responded. Now they have a 440 billion package, which would be a big help. And only last week the European Parliament voted on a massive reconstruction impetus, which will involve, and this is going to be crucial, a bigger MFF. If the European Union is to be effective, and especially Parliament, being able to pass resolutions which is based on the budget. So a bigger MFF is going to be vital, and hopefully the countries who have been reluctant to contribute more might change their views now, because demand will come from their citizens, the same as from the citizens of every other country, that more should be done at European level. Europe can only do it if they have the resources. So I think there's a message, first of all, to be got out there to governments and the member states, that if the great lockdown isn't going to become the great recession, then we all have to work together in solidarity. And I fear that the European Union will go one or two ways after this coronavirus episode. It will either collapse because of a lack of interest by people in seeing that they can deliver, or there will be greater solidarity and it will be strengthened. And I think we have to push that agenda, working together, and Commissioner Hogan mentioned this today. We can deal with issues of this nature far better than dealing with them at individual basis. So things like recovery bonds in the Eurozone are going to be very important, common debt instruments. I know there's an issue about corona bonds and there are issues about sharing debt. That's something that can be looked at in due course, but there's plenty of other things can happen besides we going down and getting bogged down that for the minute. So we have to try and ensure that the incomes of individuals are maintained. And I know in Ireland now, there are 1 million people. We had full employment up until a month ago, full employment. And now we have 1 million people who are dependent on government subventions one way or another. That will have to continue until this is over. And then, of course, the most important point is many of these people are working in SMEs. Most of those MSEs are now closed or on minimal working hours. So we have to ensure that the SMEs, as I said, are given a leg up to get back up to where they were. Once they're back up to where they were, then I think things will flow. Once we create the demand, because once the demand is there, the SMEs will flourish. And a few points which are vital in that in the overall context. The single market has been underestimated in terms of its value, and we have to ensure that is strengthened, not weakened. And while there may be need for market interruptions on a short-term basis, we cannot have protectionism. We must have a single market based on rules, as Julia Winkler said, and progressing with resilience. And also, of course, we have to look at the whole question of supply. Supply has to be more diversified. Depending on one member country, one third country, even as big as China, for a majority of supplies in one area is a mistake. That's something we need to incentivize in Europe to see how we can actually diversify our own manufacturing so that we can have more within Europe, less dependent particularly on one or two countries. Then we have to look at the whole area of trade. And while we are now, in some respects, caught up in Brexit and Brexit negotiations, I would hope that the European Commission could put that to one side and not allow it to interrupt ongoing discussions to develop trade. I am the rapporteur for Southeast Asia for our group. It's the third largest business partner we have. There's huge growth there. And once they don't succumb too long to coronavirus, that growth will continue. And we should be maximizing every opportunity to have more free trade with those countries there. That's going to be very important. The other thing I think we all need to look at, life is never the same after a major incident. Things, and what has changed here, as far as I can see, is remote working is not going to disappear as soon as we go back. There will be a demand for it. Individuals will see that they can do more work from home than they did. They can see that there will be better quality of life if they could work more from home. And of course, it will also cut down in expenses, traveling and commuting every day. So I think you're going to see a big change there. And we need, therefore, to look at the whole area of the digital. Digital, and we have mentioned that several times in the European Parliament. The European Union has worked on it. But now I think the difference now between here and a few weeks ago is that everybody sees the value of connectivity. Even, for instance, shopping. There are people now shopping online that never shopped before online. They will probably continue to do that. So SMEs in particular must be helped to be able to trade online. It was something that was mentioned several times in the past. Now, the crowd shopping, because it has now created a demand rather than before this when there might have been resistance. So SMEs will have to tap into that. And therefore, we have to look at the opportunities, help to create the market, and then, as I said, above all, help businesses who are now closed to open their doors again. Because I just see finally in my own town here of Killarney, it's a tourist town. It's now dead. I've never seen it so dead, even in the middle of winter, in the middle of the night. But it will open again. And once it's open, once people have the opportunity to spend and can get back to work again, then I think you will see things will pick up very quickly, because the opportunities will be there, the desire will be there, the appetite will be there, and once we have the support, especially at European level, then I think we can make good progress. So thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you, and well done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly, for that comprehensive overview and thorough analysis. Indeed, there are many that consider that this event can either make or break the EU, and you have hinted to the economic financial response that is available on the table, and we have yet to see what will actually come up in the upcoming months. The implications are manifold: social, economic, security, so on and so forth. A lot of it, it's unpredictable at this point, so we can only take guesses. I reckon the best thing we can do is to take try to assist things and have contingency planning. So before turning on to the interview, I have some follow-ups to the three discussants here on the political side. First of all, to Mr. Ronhoff, you mentioned the German economy and the industrial setting. 1 year and a bit ago, there was discussion on the German industrial strategy for 2030. And I'm wondering, of course, given the COVID epidemic and pandemic, to what extent do you feel like the strategy has built-in resilience in it? How are the supply chains in Germany reacting, and what are the tweaks that you would introduce concretely in this strategy looking forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Which to which extent it is that we actually now have a modification of our foreign in the EU investment screening direct regulations. Look more closely on the certain sectors which are of strategic importance. We do also see that in this regulation now, because of the crisis, the health sector is addressed as well. So that is one thing which we can directly see. Moreover, we have the economic stabilization fund with about 600 billion euro, where 100 billion euro are used for securing or safeguarding companies from foreign investment. So it's especially for those sectors which are which have to fear overtake by foreign companies. So that's some aspect and something which we can now directly see as a result. One can argue if that's because of the German industry strategy, or because of the EU investment screening directive. So it comes both together, and we have to see that that this will probably also be an instrument which really will help to make a clear signal also to those who want to profit from the crisis situation. So that's directly to your question, and I would like also to add that what Sean Kelly has said. Of course, we will see a diversified supply chain. I'm quite sure that this is one of the effects, but I won't say that this is also combined with costs for the companies. So the companies have to balance on the one hand side the risks they would take not to diversify their supply chains via the costs it takes. And so far, we from my point of view, we'll, even if we want a free market and to foster international trade, we'll have by the business new decisions which are undertaken, which from my point of view, at least in critical sectors, which are more regional, which actually in the end could also help the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ronhoff, for that. Yes, indeed, we've also heard today the Commissioner on Trade speaking about the fact that strategic autonomy in the EU does not mean self-sufficiency, given the intricacies of the supply chain. So indeed, there is a discussion at the EU level as well in terms of how can we find the most sustainable response on this, so that our companies don't end up losing out. Turning on now to from a national parliament to the European Parliament, Mr. Winkler, a very quick question for you. You have rightly mentioned the intricacies of the way forward, but I would like to ask you specifically on INTA. What do you think INTA's role will be as the elected body representing European democracy here in Brussels, in terms of finding that middle way between openness and liberal trade practices on the one side, and on the other hand, a well-defended European industry that strives for fair competition in international trade? Thank you.
Yes, well, this is a topic that we have been discussing even today with Commissioner Hogan in this video conference mode. Of course, it's not the perfect mode to debate, but it's the only one possible under the current conditions. After 2009, after the Lisbon Treaty, you have seen, and everyone could see, new competencies of the European Union. This meant also new competencies in the field of international trade. And we have expanded, I think, in the last 5 or 6 years, first of all, to a stronger monitoring of what is happening during the negotiations of the European Union. Of course, the Council is establishing the mandate, the DigiTrade does the negotiation, but the European Parliament has to give the final ratification. And in this sense, we are strongly mandated. We have a strong mandate from our constituents. And we can see in all our member states, just remember in 2014 in Germany and in France, for example, the European elections were about TTIP. Never before you had a strong debate about trade issues, 15 or 20 years ago. But in 2014, whole issue in elections was about, do we need transatlantic trade negotiation? Do we need an EU-US trade deal or not? So I think that this is the way that the International Trade Committee can have a role in what will happen in future. Let's remember also that we are not only trying to represent our citizen during the negotiations towards the European Commission by having resolutions of the European Parliament in our bilateral negotiations, but we also are trying to expand our activity in the field of monitoring the implementation of trade agreements. So we have the input from the stakeholders, and we have the input from industries. We have this structured dialogue. And so the balance that you are asking, of course, has to be a balance between maybe some expectations from groups or citizens which cannot be fulfilled by the European Union. We do not want, and we don't have the mandate to become protectionist. Protection, we have to realize, with some very careful instruments. Subsidies, at least illegal subsidies, which could qualify as illegal subsidies under the WTO, cannot be one of our tools. But support of our industries, support of trade, trade financing, and all the other instruments, trade defense instruments, non-tariff barriers, which have to become smaller. All those are among our possible instruments. And what we have to do, besides contributing to finding this balance, is also to be much more active in how we communicate, not only with the stakeholders, because of course industries have very qualified people who are understanding exactly what is happening, but we have to communicate towards our citizen. We have to explain to our citizen that there are options which may be very easily proposed by the populists. Let's close our borders, let's erect tariffs, let's defend our industries. But that is not the way to success. In the same time, we have lots of instruments which can be used much better. And I come back once again to this idea of the strategic sectors, because we could see these various forms before the crisis. We could see these various forms of trade war. We could see President Trump at war with the European Union in aluminium and in steel. We know by the other side that one of our most important partners, namely China, has huge overcapacity problems which it was not able or was not willing to tackle in the last 2, 3, 4, or 5 years. It's not a new problem. So imagine in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, all our old problems which are lagging, that we have to analyze again. Is steel a strategic sector? Is European industry as a whole a strategic sector? I would say definitely it is. Sanitary sectors, medicine. Is it safe that we are sourcing all our medicines from India and China? Not all, but more than 90%. Is it safe that we have supply chains which are very unilateral and focused to only a small number of regions where the suppliers are located geographically? Probably those things will be re-evaluated in the following months. And probably, yes, probably India would be a good partner if it would be less protectionist. Probably China could become a better partner if we succeed in our negotiations. Absolutely, the US will remain a very important partner and a natural partner of the European Union. So we will have to find the ways, and Commissioner Hogel told us something today about this. We will have to find a way to keep alive our EU-US negotiations, even if for the moment we have smaller targets, but we have to keep those negotiations alive, and we need the new partners. Just to speak about two of them, New Zealand and Australia, they might be at the other end of the world, but we will have to finalize the negotiations with those two partners. And those are not only important economies, but also like-minded partners, exactly as Canada was and is for the European Union. So we have to pursue all those goals. And I feel that our International Trade Committee, also through our political action in the parliament, but also through our structured dialogue with our stakeholders, namely industries in Europe, and of course the national parliaments, to make a bow to our colleague member of parliament, are all very important and legitimate stakeholders.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Winkler. Mr. Ronhoff, do you have a quick pointer, or is it a longer? If it's a
very short. I'm missing, even if it's quite controversially discussed, I'm missing, of course, the EU-Mercosur agreement, and this is a goal which we can achieve very quickly, and it would really help our industry. I know that it's quite controversial, not only on the European level in some member states, but also in Germany. But it's worthwhile to actually address that topic again with the background of the crisis.
All right, thank you for that. Indeed, Mercosur is not forgotten in the parliament. It is always, just turn on your microphone, Mr. Winkler, if you want to have an intervention.
Now, just one sentence. We did Vietnam, so I'm absolutely confident that eventually we do Mercosur.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. Indeed, good luck. Yeah, well, Mr. Milosevic, please.
If I can only just comment on the protectionism, I don't think anybody who knows something about the business competitiveness and how the things really work and the global chains, but that's one hand. But on the other hand, that there is a fair trade. I don't think for many years, decades, we have not had a fair trade with China. I have personal experience for many years competing with the Chinese companies, no labor law. I mean, the workers are slaves. subsidies are huge, not transparent, etc., etc. So I hope at least this huge disruption, the crisis, could be used by European Union as a whole, that we put some things right.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yes, indeed, the European Union and protectionism does not fit really well in one sentence. And from my experience with the International Trade Committee and with DG Trade has always been that primordial is the WTO compliance in all cases. So once we tick that off, then we figure out what else we need to do. China, again, a very complicated topic, but we're happy to have you at another one of the webinars that will be focusing on China to discuss this deeper. I will skip now the quick question for Mr. Kelly. We will come back to that maybe in the end in the Q&A, because we've been keeping our partners from the business community waiting here. I'm very excited to hear your reactions to what the political level has said. We think here in SME Europe that one of the most this and government, and indeed between private and public sectors. So this is why we want you to be, first of all, Mr. Ian Talbot, who is the CEO of Chambers Island and also Deputy President of Eurochambre.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation. And we try very hard at Chamber of Commerce level to remain very engaged with government at both locally and EU level. And of course, in some countries, chambers of commerce are part of the public law environment. In my country, in Ireland, and many others, we're private law organisations, so they can look very different, but we're all massively engaged in global trade. And global trade is certainly worth saving, but we really can't use global trade as a weapon, and the temptation to become more protectionist is clearly misplaced. Just looking at some of the numbers even around the current crisis, of the 164 WTO members, 114 currently tax imported medical devices, 88 tax imported medicines, 127 tax imports of disinfectants. So protectionism is seriously out there, and we need to really, change that view. And there's a message that we can do a lot globally to better weather health crises leading to economic crises like we're currently seeing. Some of the actions that we're seeing is necessary through our European organisation, Eurochambre, as well as at an Irish level, is first of all, we really need to keep trade flows open and supply chains operational to avoid a global trade recession. We need to ensure that we don't suffer unnecessary economic pain from unnecessary and disproportionate obstacles to trade internationally resulting from this virus. And this should be coupled with multilateral liberalisation initiatives, particularly on medical products and equipment, and things like a WTO zero rate for pharma products. There needs to be a realisation that a reduction in tariffs and non-tariff barriers is a very effective stimulus tool, and if used properly, can really help economic growth. And another thing of concern to us is we really need to advance the WTO appellate body interim solution and get a proper coalition of the willing together to get the WTO more effective. I was struck as well by previous speakers talking about Mercosur and Vietnam, for example, the free trade agreements there. We're very keen to leverage those in Ireland. One of the key things that we do need some focus on is we need European Union and member states to push out action plans to assist small businesses to avail of those free trade agreements. Typically at the moment, they're only availed of by the largest of the large companies. So to be of real value to our local economies, we need to see action plans for really leveraging those free trade agreements. So there's an opportunity. Some of the internal EU measures we might need to support exporters. We need member states to support things like export credit and trade finance. We need to better digitalize customs processes and procedures, and we obviously need some tolerance at the moment for SMEs trying to engage, for example, companies trying to get PPE protection equipment into the market quickly, really need help and assistance through complex customs procedures. We also need to preserve and improve the integrity of the single market. as well as collective action being required to prevent vulnerable companies from predatory takeovers from abroad. That is an important point. And another point, just as the world's largest humanitarian aid donor, the EU, along with its member states and the private sector, really need a coordinated crisis response to help developing countries and regions, particularly in Africa, to help them through this crisis. We also need to ensure that we have a proper control over our strategic supply chain security, so European resilience and reduce risky dependencies has already been discussed, so I won't go into it in any more detail. And we need to increase our independence and have the capability, for example, for surge capacities. And we need to keep our neighbouring countries closely involved as well, EFTA, the UK, accession countries, Western Balkans, and so on. Almost finished, but within Ireland, we're amongst the most open economies in the world, which meant 12 years ago, we suffered very quickly in the recession then, but we were one of the first to come out of it. We are one of the top global producers of ventilators and medical devices in the world. So it's particularly important for Ireland that supply chains remain open, so we can do our bit to help support the global effort to tackle the health crisis. Mr. Winkler mentioned Brexit, which of course is a key issue for us, and hard to remove ourselves from that concern in the background, particularly as it relates to things like trade through that island, and just how the global trade could impact the Irish economy is very important for us as well. To Sean Kelly's point, we're embracing remote working in Ireland and seeing how we can make that more permanent in the future, and also trading online. But it does raise a couple of issues. Broadband remains really important. We've consistent delivery of high quality broadband around Ireland and Europe as a competitiveness measure. But let's not underestimate the resilience of business people to get back up and running. And again, Sean mentioned his hometown of Killarney and how people are just so focused now after a couple of weeks of shock, so focused on saying, how do we get back into our normal way of doing business in a new way? Final point is the real urgency for business here, particularly around their cash flows. They need liquidity more than anything after we can get people back up and get the economy starting to open up again. And governments must make sure that aid they're able to create through financing methods are directed particularly towards SMEs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Talbot. Indeed, a long list of very good recommendations. We need to keep trade open, consolidate the single market, have collective action on strategic sectors, and most important of all, have a coordinated response at the EU level, which, given that politics and economics get together, it's not always easy to keep that as coordinated as it should be. Next, I will give the floor to Anne Stellinger, who is joining us from the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise as the head of the EU International Affairs Division. Thank you very much. The floor is
Yes, thank you very much. And many wise things have already been said by the previous speakers and panelists. I would not go back to all of that, but I think that these interventions clearly show that the crisis is global and the solutions are necessarily global. I think if there's one solution, one conclusion that we need to draw from this discussion is that the future is free and open trade. It's a well-functioning EU single market. It's to not follow the temptation of protectionism, and the corona situation clearly shows that barriers and obstacles are not the way ahead. I think that's obvious to all of us. I cannot help but picking up on Mr. Milosevic's introduction about the Swedish model, since I'm sitting here in Stockholm, living a relatively normal life, going to work, taking the metro, going to the restaurant, dropping my kids off in school, and our society is not shut down, our economy is not shut down. If there is a Swedish model, well, I think future will tell whether that is the right way to go or not. It is too early to say if Sweden has chosen the right path. We have chosen openness, we have chosen not to shut down, but we do have other things also that are integrated in the Swedish model that I think that we should remember when we talk about a Swedish model. First of all, that we have a very constructive dialogue between politics and business. And that goes back to the history of Sweden. We also have a very good dialogue between businesses, employers on the one hand, and trade unions on the other hand. There's a very constructive social dialogue at the national level, which is very valuable in these situations. We also have a very high level of digital connectivity. So basically, working from home is not an issue. I think that we all need to think about that when we go back to some kind of normal after the coronavirus. We also have very flat organizations in our businesses and in the public sector. No hierarchies, more or less, but everybody is highly responsible of their own tasks at work, and that also helps when we're all in satellite. And pragmatism, of course. So that is part of the package of the Swedish model. Now, still, we see that there are huge problems for the Swedish businesses. And I sit down with sector organizations and companies, various sectors, various sizes of businesses, from the big Swedish multinationals to the small SMEs, every day on a daily basis. And the picture that is painted goes from utter darkness to some kind of grayish tone and to a lighter shade of gray. It's easier to quote those sectors that are not affected, because one must remember that even if the Swedish society remains partly open, businesses are suffering. And as clearly is the object here, the subject of this seminar, SMEs are particularly vulnerable. Many of them are not counting by the weeks that they can survive, but on a daily basis. And we see how very viable, forceful, good health companies are actually breaking down. So this crisis is something different also, given the Swedish model. One must remember that. I think also that we need to draw some lessons when it comes to protectionism. Many of the actions that we see in Europe, but also in the world, can be easily explained by the fact that we need to put up some kind of barriers in order to avoid the spreading of the virus. But we also see that there are completely unnecessary barriers put up, and the EU is not always the best pupil in the class. The EU is also having some reactions that are counterproductive. When we sit down with businesses, the list is long, and I guess that you know many of them, but I think it could be valuable just to spend 1 minute on the obstacles and the barriers that the companies meet on a daily basis. We see, of course, that inputs are missing. Even in a country like Sweden, where the economy is open and the production is open, inputs are missing from the rest of Europe. This is affecting a number of industries, and for some, this is becoming quite dramatic. We see that there's a shortage of containers. Might seem like a detail, but it's not. They are missing, and when they are available, they come at a higher price. So for instance, when you want to ship heavy goods like wood is an important sector in Sweden. The cost of containers is really important. We see how value chains are breaking down. It's very important that we limit this damage, so that when we go back to some kind of normal, we can restore the value chains, not putting all the eggs in the same basket. We all agree about that, but we need to keep global trade open. We see also how personal mobility, of course, is severely limited, which has a natural explanation in the corona situation, but still we need key competencies for companies being able to cross borders. And these can be, for instance, energy plants or whatever that need to be surveilled and need necessarily experts in large amounts to cross borders. We need to think about that as well. We do have the export bans within the EU that are hugely detrimental and that we need to also avoid in the future. From a business perspective, the joint EU export ban is not necessarily a good thing either, because it creates a tit for tat where we have other countries doing the same, putting export bans on medical equipment and on also food, as we see in some countries. So there are concerns, even in the Swedish business society, SMEs and big multilaterals, that we see how the future of international trade post-corona virus might be a backlash, creating more permanent barriers to trade, and this should necessarily be avoided. So What we did the other week is that we sat down with all the sector organizations in Sweden and all the companies that we including the companies representing all the companies that make up the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise. And we put forward a list of 15 trade actions and actions for the EU internal market that we need to take now. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think that what we need to do is both to take away the unnecessary obstacles and barriers to trade that are being put up now, but we also need to look in much more innovative way in the toolbox that we actually do have, because there are trading tools, there are European tools that we could use in a much more, creative way than we are doing. For instance, when we see that import goods for production in Europe is missing because we cannot source from Europe since Europe is being shut down, and that we see that other parts in the world are opening up, we could temporarily make essential input goods duty-free for a limited period of time when there is a proved lack of imports. Why are we not using that tool? We also need to think about the mobility for key competences, just like I said. We need to see not just key competences for health workers and other sectors that are competences the EU has been working with so far, but we also need to look at key competences for companies. We need to, of course, this is a no-brainer, remove all EU import duties on necessary medical equipment. That should be done now. It can easily be done. There's no reason why we're not doing it. We also need to work for a multilateral, or at least a plurilateral solution on that. We need to make, the coronavirus might go to the southern hemisphere and then bounce back. It's in everybody's interest to make all those goods as smooth and accessible as possible. We need, of course, to prepare for a digital world. The world is going to be much more digital, and the list can be made much longer, but we need to think about how to reinstall the well-functioning single market, to refrain from the natural protectionist measures that reactions that we also see popping up across Europe. And we necessarily need to see that if we want a Swedish model that's working today, we also need what the future will look like. And the Swedish solution would definitely be continued open trade, not putting all the eggs in the same basket, but having those ambitious free trade agreements, kicking the WTO going again, and seeing that imports and exports and the free flow of goods and people and data and services and ideas and innovation and medical equipment is what the EU has been so successful in doing. And that's definitely what we need to do in the future, because the global crisis needs global solutions. And I'll end there.
All right, Ms. Tellinger, thank you so much. I was actually going to ask about the Swedish model, but you took that away from me. And then indeed, you've spoken like a true Swede. Free and open trade has been the ultimate conclusion here.
I choose to take that as a compliment.
Yes, certainly. Indeed, just a small reaction to you and Mr. Talbot on the export authorization scheme. Commissioner Hogan brought some light today in terms of the geographic scope, that this will be extended to EFTA and Western Balkans. So our partners are also in the commercial calculations and economic calculations that the EU is putting together. And indeed, quoting from the G20 leaders' statement, all action should be transparent, targeted, proportional, and primarily temporary. So we know that this might end up being a difficulty, but for now, as you rightly said, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Let's use the toolbox that we have at our disposal right now. And there might be some small tweaks that need to be made, but this is definitely possible. A quick question to Mr. Kelly and Henrik. Could you please let me know if there's been some activity Q&A wise from the listeners, and then maybe we can take up one or two questions from there. Mr. Kelly, until recently, the big contentious topic was obviously Brexit, and you have mentioned it, so I have to ask you a very brief question on this. In terms of the calculations on the trade negotiations, and the repercussions of the outbreak. How do you see this moving ahead? I mean, obviously, the UK government for a very long time was very rigid about the timeline. Have you witnessed any change in the political will to extend this, or what is your read on the situation, Brexit-wise? Thank you.
Unfortunately, as of now, no. But then that's not surprising, because I think Mr. Johnson has been gung-ho about delivering Brexit, firstly for the end of January this year, and now totally by the end of December this year. And I think he won't step back until the very final moments. But at the same time, speaking to everybody involved, from Michel Barnier to Commissioner Hogan, they all say that it is not doable, particularly now because of the disruption with COVID-19. And while they're going to continue on discussions now remotely, it would be very advisable for the United Kingdom to see the reality of the situation and say, listen, this is not doable in this short phase of time. Let's look for an extension. But like everything else, I think they have to do that by the end of June. Knowing their history, they'll probably wait into the last moment. Maybe the COVID situation might have improved, and they might just say they have to do it because they were out of action for a while, or else, as they normally do, blame the European Union for not being able to deliver on time. But yes, you're quite right. It would be desirable, and I think most people know that it is actually almost impossible to continue, as of now, with a timeline of a total Brexit by the end of December.
All right, thank you for that. Maybe one quick point before, or Hendrik, tell me.
Oh, no, sorry. I just want to.
Okay, maybe one quick point to the business community. One of the main issues in terms of SME activity related to trade agreements is the reoccurring low preference utilization rate numbers. And one of the conclusions that DG Trade has drawn on this, and this is supported also by Parliament, is that one of the main reasons is a general lack of awareness and the difficulty to go through all the bureaucratic hurdles that smaller businesses have to go through in order to tap into those benefits. So I'm wondering, from your experience, in whichever order you wish to speak, maybe we let ladies first, what have been some of the most successful communication campaigns that you have had in these times of when we have a lack of predictability, excuse me. We certainly need more clarity, and communication campaigns can help. So we would like to hear your experience in this sector. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, in this case, it's not ladies first, it's lady first. One comment on that. I think that, of course, we need much more communication on free trade agreements. We need much more communication on the utilization of free trade agreements. We also need to look at the quality of the free trade agreements. These are not always easily usable. I don't know who of you have read the 1,300 pages of the CETA agreement, for instance. That's not what you do on a Friday evening when you're an SME employer. At the same time, I beg to disagree, because we need to look at the statistics when it comes to the preference utilization of free trade agreements. In my previous role as Director General of the National Board of Trade of Sweden, we really digged into these figures with statistics from the utilization of Swedish companies of the free trade agreements with South Korea, looking at what type of sectors, businesses, size of businesses were using the free trade agreements and what were not using the free trade agreements. I think it's important to see that it's not necessarily a connection with the size of the company using the free trade agreement. So that speaks for it. It's not a lack of information necessarily, which only explains it, but it proves that businesses and companies are highly logical, and where there's a higher volume of the trade, meaning that it actually makes sense to put the time and effort into using the preference. of the tariff-free trade with a free trade agreement country, this is being done. So the volume, the amount of goods and the amount of the value of the transaction explains much more than the size of the company. And this actually makes sense.
Thank you for that clarification. I see Mr. Winkler wanting to intervene quickly, please.
Yes, just briefly, because I was speaking in my previous intervention about the fact that the International Trade Committee itself also is looking for new tools, and very likely the business is signaling this to us. Also, Mr. Talbot was speaking about the implementation of the FTAs and how can SMEs really benefit from the FTAs. And we are also trying to do something like this in the European Parliament. As you know, it's relatively recent tool, the implementation report. So we haven't analyzed from the DigiTrade yearly. I think we have got 2 of those already. This might be the 3rd year that we have this implementation report from DigiTrade, and we discuss it in the European Parliament. And of course, each of the members of the International Trade Committee brings with him or herself the input that that we can get from business associations and from our stakeholders.
Okay,
Thank you for that.
Oh, sorry.
I see Mr. Warburn wanting to intervene, and then Mr. Talbot. Yes.
Okay. Mr. Warburn is the Vice President of SME Europe, and yeah, I will give him the floor now. You should be able to speak now.
Okay, excellent. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Just the first general comment. I think that the closer we can be to a normal state of mind, the better it is. If the market works, that would be excellent. And just as Anna Stellingen pointed out, the Swedish model is I think it is a way of trying to make it as normal as possible. Of course, it is not normal. It is a lot of derogations from normality, but it is as normal as possible. And I think the faster we can get back to that, the better it is, of course. One example is the export authorization that the Commission has put through. I'm not really keen on that. Unfortunately, it's prolonged. And I hope it will not be prolonged further, because I think that we will have retaliations from other countries. And since we are very dependent for protective equipment from other nations, it is really counterproductive at this moment. But it is the protectionists that comes up when we get all nervous. We try to solve it by thinking that we will do it in our own community, in our own city, in our own country, or in our own region, in this case in the European Union. I think global trade is the solution to a lot of these questions. My question is for Anna, because you said you had 15 trade actions, and you mentioned key competences for businesses. And I would just like to have some details on that, because I think it would be very important for us as policy producers to listen what we can help you with in that sense. So thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this webinar. It is really timely, and it has been very good hearing from all of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Warburn. Good to have you with us shortly, but very sweet intervention. Mr. Talbot, just very quickly, we had to give you the floor for 1 second, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I can answer the previous question and the current question as well. Eurochambre and the European Committee of the Regions put together a list of recommendations for the implementation of the free trade agreement in November last year. So that would still be very fresh. So there's a complete list there that's available on the Committee of the Regions website. And just from an Irish perspective, in terms of utilisation, we heard the Swedish view. One of the challenges for Irish SMEs is that so many Irish SMEs have traditionally dealt with the UK in large numbers because it was such a convenient next door market, same language and everything else. So we really have a great opportunity for Irish SMEs to get them looking further afield as Brexit develops. And that's a key thing that we've been working on. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Henrik, I understand that there's one more question, if you would like to read that out.
Yes, unfortunately it's from an anonymous viewer, but yeah, and let me just read out. So to the MEPs of the Intercommittee, any reaction of the draft opinion of Intercommittee to the ITRE committee on a new long-term strategy for Europe's industrial future? The interlocutor is unfortunately from ID, and the draft has some worrying protectionist language in it.
All right, thank you for that. Mr. Winkler, Mr. Kelly, first come, first served. Please, sir.
Actually, I'm not aware that the INTA committee does an opinion for that report. The CULT committee does an opinion on that report, and yes, we have huge problems with the way that the rapporteur, who comes from, is our colleague in the European Parliament, but comes from a group that has many protectionist views. So we are debating it, but I'm not aware that INTA does an opinion for this. Maybe I'm mistaken.
Thank you. Would you like to confirm that, Mr. Kelly? Please unmute your mic. Yes.
Hello?
Yes, go for it, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think so too. The only thing I will say is that by the time this will be finally decided, there will be major changes, because while the rapporteur may have a particular view, at the end of the day, I think the common sense of the majority of members will hopefully take over and get a proper industrialized policy and supports, because it is something that we have been talking about for some time, but definitely now with COVID-19, there needs to be a proper and pragmatic approach, and hopefully we can get that. I know that, for instance, when we got a new parliament this time last year, many people thought, because there were more extremes elected, that they would have a very disruptive effect on the workings of the parliament. And the first real test came with the vote on the Vietnam free trade agreement, and actually the vast majority voted in favour, which was very encouraging. So hopefully, when all is said and done, that good sense will prevail. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. Yes, indeed, Vietnam was the first big test of the International Trade Committee or the European Parliament in general, as one might say. And we're very happy to see that the pro-trade consensus is still there. So there's good signals from us on that. Mrs. Tellinger, if you would like to give a quick reaction to Mr. Warborn, apologies for the little delay. We had some people.
No worries. I think that, I mean, to make it super short, I think that the Commission is doing a good job in the guidelines for workers to be able to cross borders in the EU. But we could think in new ways. We could, for instance, think about a standardized EU certificate that we could put in order for essential work in a broader sense, where companies could be engaged in defining what those essential works are from a business perspective. We also need to think about third countries, because we do have necessary inflow of people, workers in our respective countries that are not being able to come to our countries anymore. This affects many sectors, not the least in agriculture, for instance. So we need to think also about the EU entry of third country workers, and I would be happy for anyone who wants to circulate the list of our recommendations to the EU in order to get out of the crisis as smoothly as possible. It's in English, and please just contact us at the Confederation. I'll be happy to send it to anyone who wishes.
Ms. Tellinger, thank you so much for that. Mr. Milosevic, did you want to have a reaction there, or was it only a thank you for Mrs. Tellinger?
It was just a kind wish to receive a copy.
Okay, very good. So you heard that, Ms. Stellinger. We're more than excited to receive a copy of that, and we will make sure that the right people get it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure there's more ladies in the audience here, so I'm making use of that. We're very happy to having had you here today. I think drawing up the conclusions, it's always the most complicated matter, especially when the discussions have been so high level. And the degree of specialization has been very much present. Global crisis, therefore global solutions. Complex crisis, not necessarily complex solutions. We can think about simple solutions that are going to work well. One would think that solidarity at the level of the EU and better teamwork would not be so difficult, but it seems that it was rather daunting in the beginning of the process. Hopefully, as time passes, this will be picked up by capitals, as well as the coordination role of Brussels will be enhanced. I think at the end of the day, these sorts of webinars are very useful in terms of sharing experiences, sharing best practices, understanding that basically we're all in the same boat. We all have to tackle the same issues. So if we work together, potentially we have a higher chance of succeeding. So thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event. On behalf of SM Europe, have a good afternoon and stay safe, stay healthy. All the best to your families, and see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you everybody for tuning in today. We have another webinar tomorrow morning about e-commerce at 9. We have 2 more webinars next week. So if you want to stay in touch with us, just send us an email. We will put you in our mailing list. And this webinar was recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube and then be available tomorrow morning. Thank you everybody and have a nice day. Bye.
Fantastic.